This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Joining me to discuss is Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. He wrote the book Glow Kids, and just a couple of years ago released another excellent resource of a book called Digital Madness. Every parent, every educator, and all of us, for our own sake, need to read these books. I'm linking to them in the show notes as well as on social media. Dr. Kardaras, I've been thinking a lot about the sense of identity that kids develop between the gender crisis today. I'm raising my own little ones as well, and just learning so much, even just about how important mom and dad are and the different things we pass on. And for an infant, how a child thinks that they're the same as their parent for practically the first 6 months to a year, and then they start to develop their sense of self separately. But all these things that parents and the things we do and engage with develop who they are. And yet we're having this crisis of technology that you can speak to. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how technology is influencing the sense of self and identity that we see in ourselves today.
Yeah. Well, by the way, thank you for having me on the show again, Timmerie. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. And technology and identity, influencers influence. There's a profound shaping effect. A lot of times we'll focus on social media and gaming, and we'll focus on depression and anxiety. And we do sometimes also look at how it changes the wiring of our brain. So, as I like to say, that technology can be brain altering, but it's also mind shaping and identity shaping. So we don't just get more depressed when we're online or more anxious potentially, but, you hit the nail on the head when you said that infants develop their sense of identity. Infants tend to individuate and sort of separate and develop a sense of I from their moms, usually a mom and dad. From they were about 2 years old, there's individuation begins to happen when they begin to realize that they're separate human beings. But then that identity development is happening so profoundly at, when we start going between the ages of 6 to 10 years old. What we find in normal human development is that the parents are the role models up until a certain age. And, we like to think, I'm a parent of teenage boys, and, we like to think that we do the best we can to instill a sense of values, a moral compass, shape our young ones' identities. And we do, right? We do try to bake that in. But what some really large studies that showed fairly recently was that, yes, our kids emulate us. They try to do as mom and dad does up until about age 10. And then after that, peer group takes over. Peer group becomes the dominant influence. And typically daughters want to be like mom and little boys want to be like dad up until that age 10. But then after that, not that parents don't have a shaping effect anymore, but then the dominant shaping influence begins to be their friends. And what we're seeing online is that the friends tend to be digital friends now. And so online influences and online friendships and online influencers now have a disproportionate and heavier impact than, even before social media, before the digital age, where you were maybe influenced by your 4 or 5 friends in school. Now you're influenced by these. It's not just the values of the Kardashians, but it's the influencing identity of TikTok influencers who have gender dysphoria or who have all sorts of other performative types of identity that can really, really shape a lot of people. I mean, I have a treatment program in Austin, Omega Recovery, where we treat 17 to 25-year-olds, and so many of them are profoundly have had their identities shaped by their digital worlds. So, yeah.
When you mentioned that kind of breakdown from the 2-year-old is when the child first separates from that identity with mom in particular, mom and dad, but more so mom, into a self-identity. And then 6 to 10, that identity development is really occurring. And then 10 up, it's the peer group that's influencing. What a huge change in the last 15 years, where we went from your peers or the friends that your parents at least somewhat knew of who you were spending time with, to today. Literally, parents have no clue, not just who the influencers are that their kids are engaging with, but what they're really standing for, what those underlying messages, even just the way they're looking, standing, posture, clothing, is actually influencing their child today.
Yeah, in traditional media, like when we, let's go back before interactive media, back in the good old days of, let's say, television. So you always had societal influencers, right? You had athletes and movie stars and television personalities that had maybe a disproportionate impact on shaping people. So when I was a kid growing up and I was a basketball fan, and there was a whole ad campaign. I wanted to be like Michael Jordan, sold a lot of Air Jordans because people wanted to emulate Michael Jordan, or, pick a movie star, the Tom Cruises of the world, or if I'm trying to think of a female movie star that younger girls wanted to emulate. But those media stars of that prior generation, they would inhabit our minds. We would watch a basketball game once or twice a week, or we'd watch a movie every now and again, or a TV show, or maybe you'd get a magazine that had some media personalities in it. They weren't populating our minds or invading our psyches in the way that modern influences are today. Our young people today are online or in their digital world 9 to 13 hours a day. And if they're immersed in social media or TikTok or following influencers, their influencers are there constantly. And so the shaping effect is much more. So unlike, wanting to be like Mike back in, 1990, now if you want to be like TikTok influencer or Mr. Beast or whoever it is, and not just wanting to be like them in terms of the number of followers, because now it's shaped our kids' values. Because now, let's face it, what's the dominant value is followers or views that equals, people now. It's the whole system of being famous. And, they did a Gallup poll a couple of years ago where they asked high school students what their top 3 choices were for vocational career choices. And number 1 was a YouTuber. And when they did the same poll in Japan, and the number 1 answer was astronaut. And astronaut used to be, by the way, the number 1 answer in the United States in the 70s and 80s. So it's shifted who our kids want to be like, what they want to do with themselves, what their values are like. So they want to be famous, and there was a really powerful, I thought it was a great Netflix documentary called Fake Famous. It was on about a year and a half ago. And they took 3 random teenagers who were, one was a young black man from, I think it was from the Midwest. And then there was a white Southern teenage young man from the South. And then there was a young female. They had small followings in their small towns, wherever they were in. But the documentary was essentially a social experiment where the producers were going to use all their bags of tricks to sort of rocket fuel them into internet stardom. There were going to be influencers, over the course of this documentary, over the course of these next few weeks. And because that's what all 3 of them wanted to blow up, essentially. And what this documentary showed was how they lost themselves, how miserable they became, how once they did become turbocharged influencers, they were empty, and they had the followers, but it was all based on, because they were posing on fake planes and, fake profiles. And it was all such an empty value system. And so, their followers are trying to emulate people who are miserable, who have junk values. And, sometimes they have some psychiatric issues as well, because let's face it, what gets a lot of attention is performative influencers who are histrionic or have psychiatric issues. I've written about that a lot. Influencers who have borderline personality disorder or bipolar or are cutters or have all sorts of psychiatric issues are really attractive to some young people because of their over-the-top identities online.
It's really, I think, striking. I'm glad you brought this up, because the last couple of weeks I've been thinking about how when you wanted to emulate and you loved someone, let's say, such as Jennifer Aniston 20, 30 years ago, you saw her, you'd hear things in the tabloids that may or may not be true. But like you said, this person was not perpetually in your face, where you got to know everything and anything they thought about topics such as modern day Taylor Swift, where everyone knows what she thinks about gender, what she thinks about abortion. You see the clothes she wears on a frequent basis, not just on occasion. And so there's this imitation of a different person that can be so strongly held that you're taking on a persona of another individual whom you don't even know in person versus you maybe trying to act like one of your friends 15, 20 years ago, even when I was growing up, and kind of maybe at one point someone saying, well, you're behaving too much like that person because they see you spending time with that person, and maybe those values don't quite align. And so a parent's able to discuss that versus today, parents might not even realize some of what their kids are taking up are these personas, these caricatures almost, or even values of influencers.
Well, even your Jennifer Aniston example, I mean, think about how that reflects the changing medium of yesterday and today, where Jennifer Aniston, you'd have to wait once a week when Friends would be on TV because there was no streaming, so it wasn't instant. You know, you weren't watching Jennifer Aniston binge watching for 14 hours a day. You had to be patient, and when Friends aired on NBC for half an hour, you saw, and maybe you got a fan magazine, and so you emulated her hairstyle because, you know, you were a fan of hers. But Taylor Swift, now you're seeing, you know, on every football game, and you're seeing her in the NFL, and you're seeing the music. It's almost like a wraparound exposure, overexposure of this particular personality. And so in my world, there's social learning theory. So we know we model and we mimic the people that we role model after. And, you know, as we said earlier, that used to be our parents at our younger ages, but then typically it's role models that you have in popular media or heroes or things like that. But Taylor Swift has become so outsized in her influence and so outsized in her media presence because she's multi-platformed. And so, you know, how many 12 to 16-year-old girls are just swallowed up by, you know, are Swifties, you know, and want to do everything that way. And again, you had girls that used to be fans of pop stars, you know, 30 years ago, but the effect was less, I think, pervasive and less shaping as it is today.
So one of my questions is, what is the most important thing for developing a child's sense of self?
So there certainly, if you think of a person's development or a child's development is almost building a house, and you think about foundations and pillars and foundational pillars that really create the infrastructure and the foundation that the house is built on. And typically that used to be family, some kind of faith-based organization, some kind of peer group. Those were pillars that you were able to kind of root yourself into. And that's why, you know, we look at the outcomes of kids that have been raised in nuclear families with their both mom and dads around, and how different that is when you have single parent households, when you don't have the traditional nuclear family as that foundational stone. And then when you move out from the family, then you have close-knit communities. And then, like as I said before, faith-based organizations, affiliations with teams or sports or music, things that child begins to identify themselves with, and that begin to sort of create a fabric, a support system to hold their identity in and to shape their identity in. So now that young person, you know, has a sense that's defined by some of not only their support systems and their activities, but the values related to that. Because, you know, a young person who's involved in a random sport, you know, I played a lot of sports, my kids played a lot of sports, but a sports teach you teamwork and the importance of community and the importance of supporting one another and the importance of finishing something. And there are certain values that are baked in when you expose a child to something like team sports. There are certain values when you bring your child to church and expose them to faith. And those get baked in. Now, if you can bake in those values, the earlier the better, because now if you have a moral compass or a sense of those values that are baked into the DNA of that child's development, you really need to do that before they unleash the hounds of the digital world, because then that world is going to have an outsized impact on that child. And if the child isn't already rock solid on a foundational bed of a clear sense of identity and values, the digital world's going to swallow them up. And then they're going to be much more likely to, you know, fall into the turbulent waters of nonsense, you know, Kardashian values and TikTok influencers, because they don't have a clear sense of who they are. They're going to aspirationally reach to try to be or aspire towards being one of their influencers that they see having all the attention on their digital platforms. That's the key. Can you help a child develop their identity through family support and exposure, through all these healthy activities and again, faith, sports, music, all these things that can really kind of imbue a kid with a sense of who I am. because typically the ones that I work with that have not had those shaping influences, when they fall down the digital rabbit hole and they wind up in my treatment program, they're lost. They're lost. They're empty. They've been following nonsense. You have to almost rebuild their sense of who they are. And that's what we talk about. We talk about recreating a sense of identity that they can identify. So we do a whole 8-week identify what your core values are and re-explore your values. And we call it the hero's journey, where the treatment process for them is a rediscovery of who they really are deep down, not who they are extrinsically based on digital media or based on junk values that they may have picked up along the way. Sometimes we have to really rebuild that house from scratch, essentially, because it's been built on a house of cards.
This entire episode of Trending with Timmerie is on the Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers. Don't delay, download the app today, and thanks for listening.